say about prayer? Okay. So I'm also going to go ahead and mute everyone. If you have a question, you can either put it in the chat, or I'll unmute people also at the end, or I'll try to remember also to do it perhaps as we go through the sources from time to time, so that you can ask questions that way as well. Rav Soloveitchik is someone who we may be more familiar with than we were with Eliezer Berkovitz. Rav Soloveitchik was one of the most prominent leaders, if not the most prominent leader of modern Orthodoxy in the United States for a greater part of the second half of the 20th century. He had a PhD in philosophy from the University of Berlin. He came from a very prestigious rabbinic family, the Brisker dynasty, and was the Rosh Yeshiva and leader of YU, at least on the yeshiva side, for some 30 plus odd years. And his writings really animated and in many ways framed what modern Orthodoxy looked like in America. So to begin, I want to start by thinking about what Rav Soloveitchik, I'm trying to make this text a little bit bigger for everyone. I'll also read it. So if you can't, if you're having trouble seeing it on the screen. And that reminds me, Mari, I know that I owe you the sources from last time. So when I send out the sources, I'll include last week's sources and this week's sources for people who want to review these afterwards. Last time, though, Murray asked a question at the end about what his sort of conception of God was. So I actually sort of want to start there in a way and try to give us a sense, perhaps, of how Rav Soloveitchik thought about God, the dichotomy that Rav Soloveitchik saw in our relationship with God. And one of the hallmarks of Rav Soloveitchik's thought is that there's always a tension, there's always a dialectic. We're always trying to hold on to two things at the same time. So when Rav Soloveitchik speaks about how man sees God and how the Nevi'im, how the prophets saw God, he says there are two ways that the prophets experience God. And the first is found in Yeshayahu, in Isaiah, where in the way in which Yeshayahu experiences God. So there the Navi says, in the year the king Uzziah died, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirts of his robe filled the mikdash, filled the temple. Seraphs stood in attendance on him. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his legs, and with 2 he would fly. And one would call to the other, Kadosh, 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 holy, 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 the Lord of hosts. And of course, this is the pasuk that we recite in Kedusha. His presence fills the whole earth. The doorpost would shake at the sound of the one who called, and the house kept filling with smoke. I cried, woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have beheld the Lord, the King, Lord of hosts. So Yeshayahu experiences this overwhelming vision of God as majestic, as filling the Beit HaMikdash, totally overwhelming, totally other, but also very much present in this building that the Jewish people built themselves. Both other and present is how he experiences God. And Rav Soloveitchik writes about this vision. The historical setting of Isaiah's vision was one of relative peace and serenity. The kingdom of Judah still enjoyed freedom and prosperity. This vision occurred before the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, before the destruction of the first temple, which occurred in the 8th century. The temple, abounding in magnificence and beauty, stood firmly atop the fair mount. Isaiah and his people are at home, and he beheld a vision of God abiding in his home in circumstances similar to those which accompany the cosmic revelation, through the display of God's might and glory. This is how God appeared to the Jewish people at Har Sinai, full of might and glory and power. Of course, as an apocalyptic experience, the encounter with God was not lacking in some numinous aspects. We face here a dichotomy. Isaiah saw God outside of creation, high and exalted, and he discovered him within creation. Isaiah saw God's skirts filling every phase of his being. The vision of God filled Isaiah with fear. The doorpost trembled and the house was filled with smoke, representing the wholly other character of an event that evokes a dramatic response. So at this moment, though, when Yeshayahu experiences God, he does so. The first thing he sees is God when he's in the Mikdash. It seems like God is everywhere. He's in this world, but he's also totally different from this world, and he's all-powerful, all-knowing, all-encompassing, present, but also radically different, and all-powerful. That's how Isaiah experiences God, the Rav says. But there's a very different vision of God that we see described by the prophet Yehezkel, by Ezekiel. So there at the very beginning of the book of Yehezkel, it says, in the 30th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, when I was in the community of exiles by the, I think that's a typo I have there, by the Chebar Canal, the heavens opened and I saw visions of God as I gazed on the creatures. I saw one wheel on the ground next to each of the four-faced creatures. As for the appearance and the structures of the wheels, they gleamed like beryl. All four had the same appearance. All four had the same form. The appearance and structure of each was as of two wheels, cutting through each other. And when they moved, each could move in the direction of any of its four quarters. They did not veer when they moved. Their rims were tall and frightening, for the rims of all four were covered all over with eyes, like the appearance of bows which shine in the clouds on a day of rain. Such was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. That was the appearance of the semblance of the presence of the Lord, which when I beheld it, I flung myself down on my face, and I heard the voice of someone speaking. I saw someone put a question in the chat. Let me just go take a look at it. So Harvey was asking what was sort of, I think, what the cause of this experience was, right? Was it a dream? Was it a vision? It's hard to know. Sometimes the Nevi'im, right? Sometimes even, right, the Avot in the Torah, we know they were dreaming when they experienced God, because it tells us that. And certainly some of the Nevi'im also, God appears to them in a dream. This seems to be a vision that he beheld when he was very much awake. So it seems like it's something that I don't know how to explain it other than that it was a waking vision that he saw in the Beit HaMikdash. I think that, just to go back and sort of harp on the way in which Yeshayahu describes God, this really encapsulates, I think, how the Rav thinks of God as well. Like that God is, when we relate to God, we relate to this overwhelming, totally other being, totally other force, and that it is a all-powerful being that when we relate to it, demands and commands a respect, a sense of sacrifice of self in our relating to God, and that even when God appears close to us, as God appears to the Navi in this vision, right? God is in the Mikdash, in the temple, in these sort of surroundings that we're familiar to Yeshayahu. Even encountering God in a sort of familiar place should still fill one with awe and fear and trembling. Right? There's nothing in this vision, at least in this part, where that necessarily should scare the prophet, except the very experience is scary. And for the Rav, that's a part of how we that's a part of how we normally relate to God. That God is so overwhelming, so other from us. That there's a part of experiencing God that is always going to be, should always cause fear, and should always sort of awaken our sense of being on guard a bit, or having a duty to perform when we encounter God. Yehezkel, of course, doesn't encounter God in the Mikdash, because the Mikdash has been destroyed. He's in exile with the Jewish people, and instead, his vision of God is quite different. And in fact, even though at the very beginning, that first pasuk, he says, "And I saw visions of God," that's not what he immediately describes. He only gets describing visions of God at the very end of the first para. Instead, he sees all of these strange creatures. And Rav Soloveitchik writes about this vision that Ezekiel was the first prophet who encountered God in the whirlwind. He experienced the catastrophic revelation. God revealed himself out of the storm wind, the destructive hurricane that left in its wake ruins and debris in the hills and plains of Judea, and uprooted an entire people from its native soil, converting free, proud men into slaves and prisoners. Where did the prophet behold the great apocalyptic vision? In the temple, in the courtyard, surrounded by the pomp and glory of an independent people like his predecessor Isaiah? No, he met God in a prison camp, the land of the Chaldeans by the river Kebar. At the outset, Ezekiel missed God. He was confronted by mechanical forces in action, those sort of wheels and these strange creatures that he sees. They're not actually God. They represent some sort of mechanism in the universe. He perceived the tremendous energy potential entailed in this heavenly mechanism, which is engaged in perpetual motion. It seemed for a short moment that the terrifying vision beheld by Ezekiel was projected against an icy, cruel, insensitive, and insensate reality. All prayers bounced back. All petitions echoed through the empty black spaces. The warm human voice, which rose out of the depths of a yearning soul questing for God, was chilled, it seemed, upon reaching the icy heavens. Man with his aspirations, dreams, petitions, and supplications seemed nonsensical, displaced being drifting along bleak, uncharted lands, lonely and abandoned. Above his head spread forth an icy vision, indifferent and unresponsive. So the Rav is saying at first, Ezekiel's vision doesn't seem comforting at all. He sees these sort of mechanical beings that seem to represent, I think, that the universe just spins, perhaps without meaning or purpose, or certainly without anyone hearing the cries of the Jewish people or the cries of humanity. But then God disclosed himself suddenly to Ezekiel. He saw God in the likeness of a man. The questing eye of man met a lonely thou. Not in the temple, but in the camp of the downtrodden homeless prisoner. God spoke of the catastrophic event out of the distressing encounter with nility, out of the seeming void and emptiness. It took Ezekiel a long time to make the great leap from an insane existence to the throne of God that stands above the ice crystal firmament, from the absurdity of historical cataclysm to the great dialogue with hidden, numinous, mysterious God abiding behind the heavens. So for the Rav, God is to be found amidst the tragic and an existence that seems to lack meaning, and God is found within catastrophe, but it's difficult. And even the prophet Yehezkel, the Rav suggests, found it difficult to see God at first. Instead, his first vision was of a universe that just spins, perhaps without meaning or purpose. But then Yehezkel is able to see God even there, to see an overwhelming and mysterious God that lies beyond human comprehension. And we get a hint here of, I think, how the Rav is going to think about prayer in the midst of tragedy, which is that it seems at first glance like in tragedy and catastrophe especially, prayer might be meaningless because our instinct is to say, our world has gone totally insane. There's no meaning to what's going on, and there's no one in heaven who's listening. There's something very human and instinctive about that. And maybe even that's alluded to in the way Yehezkel's vision works. But then if we keep looking, or if we keep striving with prayer can allow us to create a sort of communion with God, even where we first didn't see God. And that if we keep pushing ourselves to relate to God through prayer as being a hidden, all-powerful being who lies beyond our comprehension, that creates a communion with God, even when we're in tragic and unbearable circumstances. There's another aspect, or a further aspect, that um, the Rav talks about with prayer that he develops out of the book of Eov, out of the story of Job. So at the there's a sort of climactic scene in Sefer Eov where Eov finally Eov, of course, right, is one who seems to suffer for no purpose, and after all this suffering, he gets angry and he asks God, "Why have you done this to me?" And God responds to Eov. And he says, then the Lord replied to Eov, to Job, out of the tempest and said, who is this who darkens counsel, speaking without knowledge? Gird your loins like man, I will ask and you will inform me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Speak if you have understanding. God pushes back on Eov's question and says, you don't have any understanding of the universe. You're not entitled to ask the reason why. So the Rav writes about this. The Holy One said to Job, "True, you will never know or understand the inner essence of the why, the reason for suffering and its purpose." Right? So you're not going. You will never know why suffering happens, why good people suffer. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing that you should think about in relation to suffering. That you should sort of look at suffering and just throw up your hands. But because he says there is one thing that you are obligated to know, the basis for the repair of suffering. Do you know, Job, that prayer is the province of the community, and that an individual does not come before the Lord to plead before him and request fulfillment of his needs until he redeems himself from isolation and self-containment and joins the community. And one of the things that happens at the end of Sefer Eov is that Job has three friends who try to explain to him why he is suffering. And because they try to explain to him why he's suffering, God actually ends up punishing them because there's no reason for Job's suffering, or no reason that they would certainly know for Job's suffering. And in the end, Job will pray for them for their suffering to be ameliorated. And at that point, Job's own suffering is ameliorated. So the Rav continues, did you forget that Jewish prayer speaks in the plural, and that Jewish prayer is the linking of one soul to another and the fusing of tempestuous hearts? If your soul wants to comprehend the doctrine of amelioration of suffering, you must grasp the secret of prayer that brings the I close to the other. This is realized by the one who prays and who is elevated from a personal self-concern to becoming one with the community. A wonderful thing happened at that moment. Job suddenly understood the nature of prayer, of Jewish prayer. He discovered in one moment its plural voice and the attribute of loving kindness that sweeps man from the private to the public domain. He began to live a communal life, to feel the community's hurt, to mourn its disasters, and rejoice in its moments of celebration. So the other theme that we'll see the Rav develop in terms of prayer and tragedy is that, on the one hand, prayer is about creating a sense of communion with God, feeling God's presence even when it's difficult. And on the other hand, prayer is about creating a community, strengthening a sense of community and communion amongst the Jewish people. And that when we're in crisis and we pray for one another, that strengthens our bonds. And that's an essential part of Jewish prayer as well. So those are the two themes we're going to see the Rav develop over the next little while. Any questions so far? Okay, so we'll keep going then. There's a interesting question that comes up that many theologians ask of all faiths, which is that if God is this all-powerful, all-knowing being who stands radically apart from the world, on what basis do we approach God? You know, why does God care what we have to say? Isn't it sort of trivial to bring our needs before God? And we saw that Eliezer Berkovitz sort of answers this question by saying that part of the way God constructed the universe was that he wanted man to to ask for things. And that was why that the fact that we're needy, the fact that we're finite and have needs is the reason why we're allowed to approach God. Where Soloveitchik has a slightly different take on it. So he writes that can man attain a foothold within divine transcendence? Can he shower him with a plethora of insignificant matters? Can we bother God with all of our little, I mean, they're big concerns for us, but maybe in the cosmic scheme of things, they're small concerns. And he writes first, as we've explained, prayer is a vital necessity for the religious individual. He cannot conceal his thoughts and his feelings, his vacillations and his struggles. So man, by his very nature, has to pray if you're religious. If you have a sense of God, if you have a sense of being commanded by God, you're going to feel a need to turn to God in prayer. But that really doesn't explain sort of why it's okay to do so. So he writes, second, our rabbis permitted prayer because there is a historical precedent for it. The patriarchs, Moses and the prophets, all fell before God in supplication, conversing with him as man would with a friend, laying bare before him that which is hidden in their hearts, burdening him, as it were, with their needs. And the fact that the Avot, the patriarchs, prayed is very important for the Rav. And he sees that first paragraph that we say in Shemona Esrei, where we talk about the Avot, as being almost a sort of some sort of heter almost, or permission that enables us to then ask for our own needs. But we have to make this statement that we're standing here confronting, speaking with God, asking for things on the basis of the fact that the Avot did that. That's what gives us entree into God. Because the Avot did it, we're allowed to do it as well. And third, he writes, the temple cult, the offering of sacrifices, is a fundamental ingredient in halacha. To bring a sacrifice is to come close to God. From time to time, said the Torah, man is to encounter God and stand before him. So the Torah also creates this framework where sacrifices, the fact that we're obligated to bring sacrifices, means also that we have permission from time to time to confront God with our needs, right? And there were sacrifices that were brought for personal reasons, for Thanksgiving, for if one committed a sin, for forgiveness, for very personal reasons, not just national ones. So sacrifices could be brought for personal reasons. Prayer also can occur on a personal level. Prayer also is like sacrifice for the Rav in another important way, in a way I think we don't often think about prayer. Because oftentimes we think about prayer as creating a sort of intimate connection between us and God, a sense of familiarity. And we saw themes like that even already in what we've read from Rav Soloveitchik, but this notion of prayer as sacrifice is for the Rav is important and puts a different spin, I think, on how we can think about tefillah. So he writes that there is another aspect of prayer. Prayer is an act of giving away. Prayer means sacrifice, unrestricted offering of the whole self, the returning to God of body and soul, everything one possesses and cherishes. There is an altar in heaven upon which the archangel Michael offers the souls of the righteous. Thrice daily we petition God to accept our prayers, as well as the fires, the self-sacrifices of Israel on the altar. Prayer is rooted in the idea that man belongs not to himself, but that God claims man, and that his claim to man is not partial but total. God the Almighty sometimes wills man to place himself, like Isaac of old, on the altar, to light the fire and to be consumed as a burnt offering. So with prayer, we're bringing our own being almost, kaviyachol, as it were, as a sacrifice. And that means also the way in which we pray has to mimic the way, or relate at least, to the way in which sacrifices were brought. So just as the way sacrifices were brought with a certain intentionality and a focus on decorum and ritual and sort of propriety, the way in which we pray, especially the Shemona Esrei, but I think more broadly in that, many of our prayers also has to be done with a certain amount, with a sense of kavanah, of intentionality, and propriety for how we accord ourselves, and how we relate even to the space we're occupying, because that's a space that God is present in. And the Rav's idea here of how prayer relates to sacrifice, and the fact that it means we accord ourselves in a certain way when we pray, is different from when we'll see from the Lubavitcher Rebbe when we talk about the Lubavitcher Rebbe on Tisha B'Av, where there's, I think, more of an aspect, let's say, on intimacy and familiarity. But in prayer also, for the Rav, there's a sense of a distance that exists between God and man, and God isn't just there as on the one side, God is there as a comforter, as the healer, as a listener. But if we think about that sacrifice piece, God is there as a God that is commanding. God commanded the sacrifices to be brought. God commands us to pray. And we relate, and as a commander, there's a gap between the one who is commanding and the one who must obey us. And that gap is present in prayer for the Rav as well. So there's a closeness and a distance at the same time. Any questions on that? Okay. So getting now into the more of the details of how the Rav relates to prayer, and particularly prayer in a moment of crisis. The Rav writes that tefillah, according to halacha, is closely knit with the experience of tzara, of distress. The Ramban Nachmanides, in his annotations to the Sefer Mitzvot, disagreed with the Rambam, with Maimonides' view. There's a biblical norm mandating the recital of daily prayer. So the Rambam is famously the only one of the Rishonim who thinks that there is an obligation to pray every day, a biblical obligation to pray every day. Everyone agrees there's a rabbinic obligation, but the Rambam thought there was a biblical obligation to pray every day. He says that prayer is that avodah shebalev. It's the work of the heart, it's the worship of the heart, and that we must do it every day. The Ramban disagreed, but the Rav says the Ramban agreed with the fact that anytime one is in trouble and crisis, then one must pray. And the Rav continues, the external fall of man usually occurs at a communal level. Tzara is an impersonal experience, which strikes man from outside his existence. It affects not one, but many. A famine, epidemic, or war hits groups of people. Many share the experience of distress. Many die simultaneously. Many take sick at the same time. Many starve and stand in bread lines. Communities of the suffering and distressed are formed. They can be found in hospitals, in the funeral parlors, in the jails, in the slums, on the waterfront, and on the Bowery. Therefore, when man is involved in surface crises, the Torah recommends communal prayer. The feeling of sympathy forges a sense of fellowship in prayer and tzara. That is why Maimonides speaks in terms of tzibor, community. And the halacha operates with concepts such as tefillat tzibor. The tzara assumes a public character, and the response to the divine experience is a collective one. So when we think about what we would normally call tragedy or catastrophe, these are things the Rav says that hit us from the outside. They lie oftentimes beyond our control, and they can be very isolating. Right? Something I think we've all sort of recognized. We may have all known this for a long time, but in particular, we also may have recognized it more recently. That any of these experiences can, by their very nature, they become isolated. And that prayer is about establishing this sense of community and reinforcing the sense of community and fellowship. Even though we experience these things that sort of may make us feel all alone, and tear at communal bonds. Prayer, because we pray not just for ourselves, but for each other and for the Jewish people as a whole, for the community as a whole, and because the best type of prayer happens in a communal setting, reinforces communal bonds. Prayer in a moment of crisis creates and reinforces community. But there's another type of crisis as well, he says. In contradistinction to these surface crises, the depth crisis is encountered in the strangeness of human destiny, of which man is not aware at all unless he is willing to acquaint himself with it. When man is in need and prays, God listens. The foundation of prayer is not the conviction of its effectiveness, but the belief that through it we approach God intimately and the miraculous community embracing finite man and his creator is born. Man is always in need because he is always in crisis and distress. Inner distress expresses itself in man's disapproval of himself. Man is dissatisfied with himself. He lacks faith in the justifiability and the legitimacy of his existence. Somehow every human being, great or small, however successful and outstanding, loses every day afresh his ontic fulcrum, the equilibrium of his being, which he tries to steadily recover. So the Rav says, along with these external catastrophes, tragedies, moments of distress that we experience as a community from time to time, the very nature, he would say, of being human, this is sort of a psychological take, right? The very nature of being human is that one is constantly in crisis. Because we constantly wonder if we're good enough, if we've done enough, maybe not constantly, but probably maybe every day one has these thoughts at some point. Did I do well enough on that task? Should I have done more? Could I have done this differently? We ask ourselves these questions. And because we're finite, because we're human, we're always going to be dissatisfied with something that we've done. And in that sense, we're always needy, we're always distressed. We always wish we could be more or do more or have more. And that in those moments, when we question ourselves, are also very isolating. And there's not a community of people who are encountering the same thing necessarily. I mean, on some level there is, on a very broad level there is, because the Rav thinks this is something that all of us or everyone goes through at least from time to time. But really this is something that happens internally. And the focus of prayer then is not on creating a community, a sense of community with others. There, the focus of prayer is really an individual prayer, and its focus is on creating a sense of connection and community with God, a sense of intimacy with God. Not that God necessarily, not that we think or believe God, I should say, we believe God hears prayers, right? And hopefully he answers our prayers. But more than that, the Rav is saying that prayer is, the focus of prayer is on creating this sense of connection and intimacy with God, even in a moment of distress, even in a moment where I question myself, I still feel a connection to God. And that's what prayer reinforces. That's what prayer allows us to have. It creates that relationship. And it reminds us, I think, right, that if we're commanded to pray in a moment of distress, that even when we question ourselves, God is still near, God is still present. I'm going to conclude with two more sources. One is that the Rav has a number of essays on prayer. Some are more sort of theoretical, some are more halachic, and some are deeply personal. And the last source I'll share is from one of his more personal essays about prayer. And I actually shared that essay once in the shul, and someone said to me, oh, my experience was completely different. So before I share the final paragraph, I wanted to share this piece from the Rav, which is, he has a very short sort of essay that entitled When I Speak About the Philosophy of Prayer. And he writes there that when I speak about the philosophy of prayer or the Shema, I don't claim universal validity. For my conclusions, I'm not lecturing on philosophy of prayer as such, but on prayers understood, experienced, and enjoyed by an individual. I acquaint you with my own personal experiences, whether taking into consideration the differences between minds and the peculiarities of the individual, my experience can be detached from my idiosyncrasies and transferred to others. I do not know. The Rav always felt that with any, let's say, even with any mitzvah, with any halacha, the sort of halacha was the halacha, and the outward appearance of the way in which we fulfill that mitzvah, that's going to be the same. But the way we experience that mitzvah, or the way we relate to that mitzvah, that can be different, and that can always be very personal. And that's true, that's very much true, perhaps even more true in prayer than any other mitzvah. That the way in which we relate to it, what it means to us, is going to be very different for each of us as individuals. And one of the defining moments in Rav Soloveitchik's life was the passing of his wife, who I think passed away, predeceased him definitely by a number of years, maybe I want to say around 20 or 25 years. I think she died in either the late 60s or the early 70s. And he writes in an essay that 11 years ago, my wife lay on her deathbed, and I watched her dying day by day, hour by hour. Medically, I could do very little for her. All I could do was to pray. However, I could not pray in the hospital. Somehow I could not find God in the whitewashed long corridors among the interns and the nurses. However, the need for prayer was great. I could not live without gratifying this need. So in the hospital setting, which is for all of its, for all the distress one feels there, I think the Rav is suggesting, at least for him, also felt, let's say, very sterile and impersonal. He couldn't relate to God in that setting. But he couldn't live without gratifying this need for prayer, right? He said a religious individual in their very nature needs to pray. The moment I returned home, I would rush to my room, fall on my knees, and pray fervently. God in those moments appeared not as the exalted, majestic king, but rather as a humble, close friend, brother, father. In such moments of bleak despair, he was not far from me. He was right there in the dark room. I felt his warm hand, kaviyachol, on my shoulder. I hugged his knees, as it were. He was with me in the narrow confines of a small room, taking up no space at all. God's abiding in a fenced-in finite locus manifests his humility and love for man. In such moments, humilitas Dei, which resides in the humblest and tiniest of places, addresses itself to man. So in a moment of, normally, I think the Rav is saying, in our day-to-day lives when things are going well, or in the Shemona Esrei that we recite 3 times a day, we relate to God as ruler, as king. There's a distance between us and God in the way we approach God as prayer. And we should focus in a way on that distinction. That gap is important. It enables us to relate to prayer as sacrifice, to be reminded of our limitations when we relate to God in prayer, of the gap that separates man and God. But at a moment of tragedy, we relate to God in prayer in a totally different way. God as a comforter, as a family member, someone who is really with us in a very intimate way. And that prayer in that moment isn't driven by, it's driven by the hope that God hears our prayer, but more than that, it's driven by a sense of wanting to feel God's presence, to feel a sense of comfort, to be reminded that we're not alone. And prayer, being told to, the mitzvah to pray, always ensures that we create this sense of community, a sense of community with others, with the Jewish people as a whole, when we experience communal tragedy, and a sense of community, a sense of connection to God when we experience personal tragedy. Because tragedy ultimately, one of the many ways it affects us is by making us feel alone. and prayer is about making us feel connected to others and to God. So I'll leave it there for tonight with the sources, and I'll open it up